R-series Astromech droids were ubiquitous during the Clone Wars and the Imperial era, used as mechanics, navigators, or co-pilots by billions of beings all over the galaxy. Any Star Wars fan is familiar with these plucky little guides, especially the R2 series, made famous by the one and only R2-D2. But the R2s weren't the only R-series Astromechs. In total, there were 10 different R-series Astromech models, plus one prototype model. Some you likely know well, and some that you've probably never heard of. In this video, we'll be providing brief overviews of all 10, and determining which Astromech was the best.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
R-series Astromechs were all products of Industrial Automaton, one of the largest droid-making conglomerates in the galaxy. The R-series was IA's flagship line, made ubiquitous by the incredibly successful R2 series. But before the R2s, Industrial Automaton made two earlier attempts at cornering parts of the Astromech market. The first was the precursor to the R-series, the P2 series Astromech droid. These droids were produced exclusively for the Old Republic shipping fleet, and they were extremely similar in design to the later R2 series, at least on the outside. However, the P2 was a pretty terrible Astromech. The design had numerous flaws that made the droid clumsy, while its brain was unintelligent and buggy. Since the P2 was only sold to the Republic, however, it didn't hurt Industrial Automaton's reputation as a producer of Astromechs, giving the company a second chance. It seized this chance, designing the R1 series Astromech droid to replace the P2 and sell on the open market. The R1 was the first of the R series, but it looked absolutely nothing like its successors. To start, it was nearly 2 meters tall and densely armored, based on the design of IA's Mark II reactor drone. This made the R1 slow and unable to fulfill all of the functions Astromech were expected of it, but it made up for these shortcomings with its repair and navigation capabilities. The R1 had the memory space for 500 different Starship schematics, granting it intricate knowledge of how to repair and maintain many different vessels. Furthermore, it could act as a hyperspace navicomputer, calculating hyperspace jumps for its parent ship. This revolutionary trait became the defining feature of the R series, and because of it, the R1 was very popular. Industrial Automaton capitalized on the success of the R1 by completely reinventing the consumer Astromech. Its next generation design, the R2 series Astromech, became one of the best-selling droids of all time. The R2 was based on the P2, but it was much smaller and much more efficient. Unlike its predecessors, the R2 was only about a meter tall, allowing it to fit into the utility droid slot of military starfighters, something only military-exclusive droids had previously been able to do. On top of this, the R2 was a more effective navigator than the R1, capable of holding 10 sets of hyperspace vector coordinates in its memory, and it could memorize the schematics for over 700 Starship models. This, plus the droid's enhanced maneuverability, made it a revolutionary advancement. The next few R-series Astromechs didn't diverge much from the R2. The clear-domed R3 and the cone-headed R4 were specialist models that made small improvements on the R2 design while catering to specific clientele. The R3 was meant for service aboard large capital ships, with its schematic banks and toolkit designed specifically for compatibility with warship mainframes and reactor systems. The R4, meanwhile, was an agromech droid, marketed towards settlers in the Outer Rim. The R4 was designed to act as a garage mechanic for frontier families, sacrificing a lot of the neat tricks boasted of the R2 and R3 in exchange for superior maintenance abilities. It wasn't meant to be paired with starfighters, as it had only enough memory to calculate one hyperspace jump, but with some effort, it could be modified to do the job. Then, there was the R5, described by MechTech Illustrated as a meter-tall stack of the worst business decisions you could possibly want. The flat-headed R5 was essentially a budget R2, which Industrial Automaton hoped they could sell to people who wanted an Astromech but couldn't afford the other superior models. Indeed, The R5 was much cheaper than any other R-series astromech, but as the saying goes, you get what you pay for. The R5 dropped plenty of features and was plagued by mechanical problems. R5s were known to suffer from bad motivators and faulty personality matrices, among other things, which meant they ended up costing many owners thousands of credits on repair work. After the failure of the R5, Industrial Automaton wisely stopped trying to improve upon perfection. For a few decades, they just coasted off the success of the R2, R3, and R4, which became ubiquitous throughout the galaxy during the Clone Wars and the Imperial period. After the Battle of Endor, however, the galaxy began to change, and to meet the changing times, I put out yet another astromech, the R6. Though the R6 looked a lot like the R5, it was essentially just an R2 2.0. The R6 shared all the functionality of the R2, with improvements here and there, as well as a cheaper price tag. The R6 was extremely popular, which gave Industrial Automaton the confidence it needed to keep making new astromechs. Shortly after the release of the R6, Industrial Automaton put out the R7, a new, highly advanced astromech designed to work with the New Republic's new E-Wing starfighter. The R7 was much tougher than older astromechs and shielded against ion cannon fire, giving it greater survivability in battle. It also had better memory, able to store 15 hyperspace jumps compared with the R2's 10 and the R6's 12. However, the R7 was expensive and only worked with the E-Wing, requiring extensive modification to be usable with any other starship. Industrial Automaton didn't stop with the R7. As the E-Wing started to fade in popularity, IA decided it was time for a new astromech. Enter the R8, produced shortly before the end of the Galactic Civil War in 19 ABY. The R8 was marketed as a return to the roots of the R-series, featuring a dome-like head with a satellite dish on top. Its purpose was to improve upon the advancements made with the R7 and make them generally accessible, and in this, the R8 was pretty successful. The R8 could do everything the R2 and R6 could, but better, and it could also serve as a dedicated gunner, which previous R-series astromechs had not been programmed for. When the R8 was still in the design phase, it was rumored that the droid would be the first R-series astromech to speak basic. This rumor proved to be false, which is a good thing, because it would be heresy if it were true. The last known R-series astromech model was the R9, which was produced after the Yuuzhan-Vong War. The R9's capabilities aren't well known, but they appeared to be mostly the same as the R8's, albeit more capable in some or all respects. The only bit of concrete information we have about the R9 is that they were notorious for being overzealous with their self-preservation routines, which left them suspicious of their owners to the point where they occasionally withheld valuable information. Now that we've taken a look at all the R-series astromechs, it's time to choose the best. Let's start by picking out the more subpar models. The P2 was obviously the biggest dumpster of the lot. The R5 honestly wasn't that far behind it. It was more useful to be sure, but as anyone who's ever owned a poorly designed car knows, when you have to constantly repair something just to get the bare minimum out of it, it isn't worth the time and money. Additionally, while it was a good model for its time, the R1 was so far outstripped by its successors that it also sits near the bottom of the pile. Around the middle of the list, we have the specialist astromechs, the R3, the R4, and the R7. These droids weren't bad at their jobs by any stretch, but their specialization hurt their utility. The R7 was the worst offender, since it was outright incompatible with all but one starfighter model. The R3 and R4 suffered from similar flaws. Without modification, the R3 wasn't much good outside of a large warship, and the R4 was only as good as a garage hand. That leaves us with the R2, the R6, the R8, and the R9. We don't know much about the R9, but its cagey personality inclines us to rank it below the other three. In third place, believe it or not, we have the R6. Even though the R6 made many minor improvements over the R2, it didn't even come close to the longevity of IA's signature model. The R6 was better on paper, but it didn't last nearly as long. R2 series droids were reliable for decades, performing effectively alongside every single one of their subsequent generations. With that said though, we're regrettably going to have to give the R2 second place in favour of the R8. The R8 also had longevity on its side, and unlike with the R6, its improvements on the R2 were all significant. The R8 far outperformed all the previous R-series droids in every single respect, and it also brought new features to the table. All told, we're going to have to give it the win. But what do you think? What's your favourite Astromech droid model? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comments below.